I spent years in the church as a worship leader and the music director at my church. I was there about 12 years before we were just touring too much to be able to do that. But I am really passionate about worship, and I think with my background, there's some really practical things you can do to get your church more involved in worship. And sometimes I get frustrated because people will define worship as singing a song in church. Well, worship is your life. I mean, worship is how you live each day following Jesus. That's worship. But if we're talking about the practicality of worship in church and how do we get people more involved, and specifically how do we get people more involved in the music portion of church, there's some spiritual things you can do or check and make sure you're doing, and then there's some really practical things you can do. Spiritually speaking, I always tell people, if you're going to lead worship, you have to be worshiping. There's no way, it says you're leading worship, so that involves two things. One, that you are worshiping, and two, that you are leading. So it's not standing up there giving a performance, it's worshiping God and inviting people into that with you. If your team's not worshiping, then your church is not going to be worshiping. And that's probably the most important aspect of leading worship. But from a practical perspective, some of the things people can do to really get their churches more involved in worship, I've seen a real tendency lately to be trying to do contemporary songs in the key they're found on the radio. Well, most Americans can't sing in that range. And so we have worship leaders, many of them are high tenors or low altos, and they're singing in a range that is really uncomfortable for most Americans, and especially most non-musicians who are the people making up our congregations. So one of the most practical things you can do is put it in the key that everybody likes to sing. I wrote an article recently called Why Has My Congregation Stopped Singing? And we outlined, how do you place that in the key people like to sing in? Another thing that's real practical is your lighting and your sound inviting? Is it inclusive? Sometimes I see churches where they light up the stage or the platform really, really bright, but then they leave everybody in total darkness in the congregation, and that just says, you're not really involved, this is a show, we don't really want you to be involved. What can you do as a church with your lighting to make people feel like we're doing this together, this is corporate worship, this is something that we participate in as a people of Christ worshiping God? Same thing with your sound. Is your sound, can everybody hear? And is everybody feeling included in that? Sometimes it's so low people can't hear. Sometimes it's so high people feel like they need to run out of the room because it's hurting them. So what are you doing with your sound levels? What are you doing with the balance? All those things are just practical things that invite people into worship. There's a lot more that I could say. I'm actually working on a book about that right now. But I really hope that churches can just grasp some of those really practical things, because it's such an important thing. We're commanded by God to worship, but we're also compelled by the love in our hearts for our Lord to worship. And so I really feel passionate about churches doing everything they can to make that inclusive and something that invites people to participate. So it's been great talking with you. Thanks for spending a little time with me, and I hope to see you at a show or online sometime soon. Thanks.